warm welcome and thank you for joining me on the program. I am Folashade Ogurinde. President Muhammadu Buhari's proposed budget of 16.34 trillion naira for the 2022 fiscal year is currently undergoing scrutiny in Nigeria's upper and lower chambers. Now, the key parameters and fiscal assumptions of the budget are oil price benchmark of $57 per barrel, a daily oil production estimate of 1.88 million barrels, exchange rate of 410 naira per US dollar, projected GDP growth rate of 4.2% and 13% inflation rate. Also, the budget is expected to be funded by more borrowings as the total revenue available to fund the 2022 federal budget is estimated at 10.13 trillion naira, while total expenditure has been pegged at 16.39 trillion naira. Now, this leaves Nigeria with a budget deficit of 6.26 trillion naira. Today on the program, we'll be analyzing some of these highlights, especially those that have drawn widespread criticism. I'm joined now by Vayala Kwagu, Senior Research and Policy Analyst at Budget. Thank you so much for your time. Now, a good look at past budgets shows a steady rise in budget deficits. From the economic standpoint, is this something we should expect for future budgets?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There are indications that the federal government will continue to borrow, and that is worrisome because despite the fact that the federal government was able to record improvements in non-oil revenue as above oil revenue, it is still not enough to meet these finance gaps that are many and far between. If you look at the medium-term expenditure framework, the deficit figures will stabilize. They may not climb, they may not exceed the points they are now. It's about 6 trillion naira deficit. It may not exceed 6 trillion naira, but yes, there certainly will be more borrowing. Whether that is a good or a bad thing is really up to what the future will portend. But if the government is unable to rein in the size of the deficit compared to other aspects of finance that need attention, then we certainly will have a problem.
Now, what do you find worrisome about Nigeria's rising debt profile, especially when one considers the country's earning power?
So it's worrisome because there is a lot that this money can do. The problem with debt is that while it's not, in quote, a bad thing, it does mean that you are using money that you could have used for internal projects to pay back loans. Because not only will you pay these principals, but you will be paying interest. As a matter of fact, it is so compelling that oftentimes the presidents of countries will go before the United Nations General Assembly and ask for debt relief, or go to the countries that house, say, the highest number of creditors and request for debt relief or debt forgiveness, as the case may be. This means that there are very negative consequences that come with high debt. Secondly, it will mean that with the little funds that Nigeria will raise or may be able to raise, it will have to commit that money to paying off this debt. Now, these problems are even exacerbated further by the fact that the Naira isn't doing very well as a currency. Many of us are aware of the depreciation of the Naira, which, could be argued economically might be good for exportation, but is not good for domestic savings and consumption. So it really opens up a Pandora's box, if you will, of problems. Yes.
Now, the president in a speech spoke about increasing revenue majorly through more taxation. Do you think this is the right strategy to deploy at a time like this?
I think it is the right strategy. I think there's no time like the present. However, there is a huge legitimacy gap. So we have financing gaps, and we also have political gaps in terms of the legitimacy or perceived legitimacy that Nigerians have with their governments, both at state and at the federal level. So taxation implies monies being taken from citizens, their incomes being taxed to fund infrastructure, to run government. Now, if Nigerians do not see improvements in their livelihoods, which should be as a result of that governance or that good government and their money is being spent well, and if they see members of their government living very profligate lives and spending their monies on travels, on cars, on things that they do not think are important or necessary, then that legitimacy gap widens and people will not feel like their taxes are being used appropriately. Fiscally, it's good for a country. Reliance on oil for Nigeria has been a very bad relationship. Oil price volatilities really affect Nigeria's income levels quite critically. And we've experienced this time and time again. And we've been unable to wean ourselves off of oil occupying a major share of Nigeria's revenue. The sooner we can transcend to improved taxation, the better it will be, not just fiscally, because it does mean that incomes or revenues that the government is raising are more predictable. It spells better for politics and even for accountability and transparency. Because for a government that requests more taxes, it must also expect to be held accountable far more often.
Now, speaking of accountability, despite accusing the National Assembly of being unable to account for annual 100 billion naira constituency projects fund, the president has again voted 100 billion naira for the lawmakers' zonal intervention projects. Now, Nigerians have always had this problem with allocating huge sums of money to either the executive or to the legislature for different projects or whatever reason, while capital projects or other things that seem important to the average Nigerian rather is not given much attention to. So how do you react to this in terms of allocation of monies in the budget?
So, I mean, it could be argued either way. There are needs of communities that may not necessarily be capital needs. But then the question becomes, how can people's livelihoods be improved such that they do not need those things? The general idea is that capital projects can be either hard projects, roads, bridges, infrastructure, or soft ones like a functional justice system and an efficient civil service. So unfortunately, our experience from 1999 till now has not translated to this real sustained improvements. There have been peaks, a few peaks, but it's mostly been valleys. And this is principally because there is no direct relationship between measuring government output in terms of measuring the effect, intended or otherwise, of these capital projects. So for example, you want to build a hospital, 10 hospitals in 3 geopolitical zones. The government builds the hospitals, but oftentimes does not equip them. And even when it does equip them, it does not staff them or man them with doctors. And even when it does do that, does it follow up to see if this hospital has reduced maternal mortality or has reduced the rate of maternal mortality or neonatal mortality, or has reduced the rate of, say, tropical disease prevalence, or what have you. So in summary, I'm saying there is an inability on the government's part to measure its own progress. So this brings into question the issue of constituency projects. Lawmakers are not equipped. That is not the function of a legislature to dole out money in that way. Legislatures are creatures of political contest. Hundreds of years ago, some people in some parts of the world realized that they needed to keep hold their leaders accountable. And they decided to come up with a people's assembly that represented the very needs of the people, as opposed to the needs of an executive or a monarch. So unfortunately, the case for Nigeria is that oftentimes the legislators sort of take their own needs more seriously above those of the people they were called to serve. And when they do carry out constituency projects, if and when they do, it ends up just being, an exercise as opposed to meeting a need and ensuring that this money is given to really raise people's livelihoods so that next fiscal cycles or next budget cycles, the monies can be used in other ways. in short, the dichotomy is there. Capital projects should be handled by executives. Should constituency projects be handled by legislators? I don't think so. I do not think that it's in their makeup to really oversee and supervise projects like that.
Now let's shift gears now and talk about the parameters and assumptions in the 2022 proposed federal budget. Now, some have said pegging the price of oil at $57 per barrel is quite low and not sustainable. Do you agree?
I agree to some extent because it's oftentimes better to be pessimistic about the goose that lays your golden egg. 90% of Nigeria's revenue comes from oil sales. And if we are too optimistic in our projections and oil price volatility happens again, which has been the case in the past, it means that we would actually be making far less and there would be far less available to fund the budgets. So in the event that the oil price stays at that mark projected or goes slightly above, these excess monies can then be saved. I would say that it's a much better risk approach to be conservative in your projections as opposed to being overly optimistic. There's only so much information we can get from studies and analysis of what the future of oil will be, but I think keeping it at a conservative rate is much better risk management, yes.
Well, it's been a lively first half of the conversation, but we'll go for a short break, and when we return, the discussion continues. To stay with us. Corruption not in my country.
Hello, Alhaji. Right now I'm in Abuja. No. Hello? Adamu. Right now I'm in Kano. Yes. When I get back, I'll just call you. Look, what is wrong with you? I'm talking on the phone and you are gesticulating and doing. What's wrong with you?
Daddy, where exactly are we as we speak?
Are you alright? This is Lagos.
Well, you just lied to someone that we're in Abuja.
Keep quiet. Who told you can tell an elderly person is lying?
Daddy, you just lied. And by lying, you are raising corrupt children for the future of Nigeria. That is corruption, not in my country. Corruption not in my country.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us, I've been discussing and analyzing the proposed 2022 budget with Viola Kwaga, a senior research and policy analyst at Budget. Thank you so much for standing by. Our Vice President Yemi Osinbajo recently criticized CBN's forex policy for being artificially low at 410 naira per dollar. However, the 2022 budget parameter pegged exchange rate at 410 naira per US dollar. What do you make of this?
So, I mean, the forex market is a very, very dicey one. The problem with your currency being, would you call it like a managed float? I think it's like a managed float in some way, is that it could be tossed back and forth by several factors. One of them being the productivity of your own country. So Nigeria's naira is depreciating. It does mean that it can sell more in terms of its exports will be cheaper. But where the country isn't productive, then there's a limit to how much it can make with its currency. There are nations in this world, some of them the economic powerhouses of their region, that deliberately devalue their currencies so they can sell more. But they are productive economies. The case of Nigeria is much more different. Again, the US dollar in many respects is like a commodity in and of itself. Forex traders would bear me witness on this. A lot of people go into speculation to see how much they can make really as the dollar is being traded every day. So you have a medium of exchange that has several characteristics. I suspect that the Vice President's remarks were geared towards a perspective that sees exchange rate management as being something better left to market forces. Because the problem with creating a peg on an exchange rate is that you will encourage arbitrage. You will encourage that same speculation and further create more problems for sales of exports and imports and even payment for goods and services by citizens of your own country. I mean, it's common knowledge that parallel markets exist, and there's a huge gap between what the CBN declares as its rate and what you can get on the outside. And remember, Nigerians use the US currency to pay for a lot of things. In a hypothetical scenario where we were not paying so much on foreign education and the imports of certain goods and services, and our exports were much more diverse, then perhaps this depreciation would have been a good thing. But as it stands, it is very difficult to manage and will create more problems than solutions really in the future.
Now let's talk about inflation rates. How realistic is the 13% inflation rate projections, especially when you compare it to what we currently have now, which is well above 17%? Do you think it is something we can achieve?
So it really depends on the CBN's approach. They have they have meetings that they hold every month where they determine interest rates, where they determine the cash reserve requirements of banks and other financial institutions. And these really go a long way into determining how much inflation will be. Whether they have been successful in reining in that inflation, I mean, the evidence is quite clear. But it is good to set targets. Governments across the world have inflation targets through which they intend to reach. The advice by international financial practitioners is to maybe not use a specific figure, but a range wherein your country can gradually begin to approach. Because there are so many factors involved in inflation management, some of them being, of course, again, internal productivity, which is not just a federal government problem, but even a state problem, because the commercial markets, industries are not within the exclusive preserve of government. They are for the private sector. But then again, the government does need to create an environment for the private sector to make enough money so that the economy can stabilize, and taxation and revenue and inflation management and exchange rate management can all have a more mutually reinforcing relationship as opposed to what is going on now. So in summary, yes, I do think setting a target is good management. I would think, or I would prefer a range instead. But can it be achieved? We'll really have to wait and see in subsequent months what the CBN says about its interest rates, about the cash reserve requirements, really the cost of borrowing and lending between banks.
Now, before I let you go, let me ask you about some of the allocations on the budget. President Buhari came under heavy criticism for not allocating as much as he promised to the education sector. Now, some legislatures have also called for more money to be funded into the health sector. Now, how do we balance these allocations, especially when we factor in defense, which took a huge part of the budget?
Yes, that's correct. Thank you. So really, it is a question of priority. And these kinds of conversations, though they may seem difficult, are actually why governments exist and should be expected. The legislature is there to provide oversight on government spending and really call to question the goals and the agenda of the executives. However, the challenge oftentimes is a lot of our conversations do not come from a place of evidence. So what is the evidence saying? For the evidence to say one thing is one hand of the argument, but the broader national goals, the medium-term plans, and the existing problems also have to be addressed. So it then becomes a matter of priority. Should the government prioritize spending on defense? We have seen in the past, I think 2 or 3 years, a rise in the rate of banditry, in kidnapping, of insurgency, and a a considerable rise in the spending in these sectors, but the security situations do not seem to be improving. So are we getting a value for money in this security spending? Yes, health is a very critical concern, specifically with the COVID-19 pandemic mutating into several new variants. There is a need to address this, not just COVID-19, but other existing tropical diseases and other aspects of health provision from primary to tertiary. Education is also extremely important because along with health, improvements in health and education raise the quality of life of people. But you cannot have a good quality of life if you are insecure. It would be difficult to say for sure what line or what approach would be the most optimal. But this is a question that governance should address, and government should explain why it is taking these policy decisions that it is taking.
Well, indeed, Ms. Vayala Kwaga, Senior Research and Policy Analyst at Budget. Thank you so much for your time on the program.
Thank you for having me, Shadi.
Well, and it's a wrap on the program. Thank you so much for watching. See you again next time next week. I am Fola Shadi. Green Day. Bye for now.